Oh, hello everyone. Welcome back to our fourth episode, where we're going to talk about, you guessed it, music. So what do you listen to? Eminem, Ariana Grande, Michael Jackson? Although we all seem to have different tastes in music, none of us can deny that we love listening to our favorite songs. But why do we love music so much? Just like everything else, the answer lies in the brain. Before we discuss the brain's relationship to music though, let's first talk about the ear, the organ we all think is responsible for allowing us to hear. Although it is very important, it's certainly not the only factor required. But, before we even talk about the ear, what is a sound? I mean, when you hit something on a desk, it produces a sound. And what causes that sound to occur? Well, let's say this whack produces a sound. The reason why that occurs is because the surface of the table, once it's whacked, actually vibrates. And this whack actually vibrates the air around the surface, pushing the air. And your ears eventually detect this motion of the pushed air and calls it sound. This makes sense. Think about it. When you are farther away from the source of a noise, let's say I whacked the table from a distance farther away compared to a distance closer. Clearly, the sound that's closer will sound more louder, right? But in reality, the reason why this occurs is because the sound that's farther away actually doesn't push the air as significantly because it's farther away. So at your point, there's gonna be less pushed air, and the amplitude or the significance of that pushed air will be less compared to when the sound is closer to you. Therefore, you cannot hear a sound as strongly if it is a farther distance away. In space, let's guess. What would happen if we tried to whack a drum with a stick? Well, quite obviously, you can't hear the sound because in space, there is no air, and therefore, there's nothing that sound can really be transmitted through because the space is really empty. So astronauts have to talk to each other in space through radio signals, which we will talk about in a later video. Okay, so here's a diagram of our ear. I'm guessing there's much more than you expected. But essentially, all of these parts are required in order to allow us to hear what we do. In fact, if you look, here is the sound source. So let's say that the sound is somewhere far to the left of the ear, right? And it's producing a sound wave by way of pushing the air around it until the air that's being pushed is close to our ears. So anyway, eventually the air inside of our ear will be pushed, and eventually it will go into our ear, and that pushed air will push on this part right here called the eardrum. So in order to capture all this excess sound and concentrate it into this area called the auditory canal, the pushed air actually comes into our area called the pinna. And the pinna is kind of like the outer shell or the outer covering of the ear. This is typically what we think about when we hear someone saying the ear. We typically picture in our minds the pinna. But really the pinna is just the outer component. There are a lot of stuff and parts inside that are also very important. The pinna takes in the air that's being pushed and concentrates it into the auditory canal, which is right here. Eventually, the auditory canal has the sound waves that are being pushed and actually pushing the eardrum. So once the air particles are pushing on the eardrum ends up pushing on these three bones right here, which end up compressing the parts that are inside of the ear itself. So the eardrum actually pushes on three bones called the incus, malleus, and stapes, which are these three parts right here, and each of these end up pushing the next bone, which eventually reaches this bone right here, which is called the stapes, and the stapes ends up pushing on the cochlea. The cochlea is this weird snail looking organ right here, which is really filled with fluid, which is liquid, and the liquid ends up allowing the cochlea to rub against the hair cells, which are right here, and the hair cells, when they are rubbed, the ends of the hair cells produce electric signals. And recall our last video. Electric signals are essentially the type of signals that allow us to transmit signals to the brain by way of neuron signaling. So that's how the signal of the air being pushed can eventually lead to motor motion within the ear, and that motion is converted into electric signals. Those electric signals are converted into commands that our brain understands and realizes what's going on. The ear doesn't actually tell us what we are hearing. It simply lets us know that there's something out there that produced a noise. Our brain's responsibility is to further break that down and understand what exactly did we hear, and where is that noise coming from, and what does that mean we should do. Those type of cognitive answers lie within the brain. The ear is one major component, but the brain is also another. And impairment in either part can lead to hearing loss, which can lead to deafness as well. So remember our first video in the series? This is the brain, and the brain has different parts. Do you recall which part of the brain actually controls hearing? Well, you can pause the video and try to guess. But hopefully you answered this part right here, which is called the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe helps us understand why we are hearing what we do. And really there is an area in the frontal lobe as well, which is really important for us to produce speech. But in order to understand speech and what's being actually heard, the temporal lobe is really important. And impairment to the temporal lobe in certain regions can actually lead to something called aphasia, which is our inability to actually understand and comprehend language. And that could result in our inability to hear, or at least effectively communicate. So it's very important that our temporal lobe is intact for our ability to hear. So you can thank the auditory cortex, which is found within the temporal lobe, for allowing us to hear your favorite singer, or actually our favorite song itself. There's a lot of research being done right now as to how listening to music can actually help us feel certain emotions. Emotions are controlled by something within the inside of the brain called the amygdala. That's called the fear center. Whenever there's something like a bear standing in front of us that's suddenly about to scratch us, we feel intense pangs of fear as a result of the amygdala in the interior being triggered. And really, scientists are trying to understand the link between the temporal lobe and its understanding of speech as well as hearing, and how that relates to us realizing how our music affects our mood. And really, music and the ability to understand the emotions associated with music, that sort of processing doesn't necessarily only occur in the temporal lobe. The beauty of the brain is that all of these different parts work together, and that's what makes the brain so interesting but also so confusing to understand. Well, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope now when someone asks you why you love your favorite song, you can give them the correct answer and tell them a thing or two about the brain as well. Please like this video, subscribe, and support the Brain Bunch in order to help students and communities learn about the brain, by volunteering with us or donating at thebrainbunch.com. See you next time, where we will discover confusing, weird illusions and how they connect to the eyes and in turn the brain.